The deafening crack of a hammer against the auctioneer's podium silenced the crowd gathered in front of Abigail Whitfield's modest home on Kennewick's dustiest street. Montana Territory, 1878, was unforgiving to widows, especially those with debts that seemed to multiply like weeds after a spring rain. Abigail stood rigid, her face a mask of practiced composure as she watched strangers pawing through her family's most cherished possessions, laid out across hastily assembled tables in her front yard. "Next item," bellowed the auctioneer, a stout man whose voice carried across the yard with practiced efficiency. A silver pocket watch, English-made, circa 1820. Belonged to Mrs. Whitfield's grandfather, starting bid at $5. Abigail bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. That watch had crossed an ocean and a continent before reaching her grandfather's pocket. Now it would disappear into a stranger's hands. She tried everything to keep her family home after Thomas died, taking in laundry, selling baked goods, even working nights at the hotel doing mending. But the bank loan her husband had taken out to expand their small cattle operation had come due, and without the herd that sickness had claimed last winter, she had nothing to offer but her family's treasures. $5, called a voice from the back. A murmur rippled through the crowd as it parted to reveal a tall man Abigail didn't recognize. He stood with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, though his clothes were simple, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, denim pants tucked into dusty boots. The only extravagance was the quality of his hat, a well-shaped Stetson that shaded eyes that seemed to catch and hold the Montana sunlight. $10, the stranger called before anyone else could speak. The auctioneer raised his eyebrows. $10 for the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 11? No one moved. The town of Kennewick had been hit hard by the same cattle disease that had devastated Abigail's small herd, and few had money to spare for luxuries. Sold for $10 to the gentleman in the back. As the auction continued, Abigail noticed with growing bewilderment that the same stranger bid on every single item, from her mother's delicate china tea set to her father's handcrafted chess pieces. Each time, he bid well above asking price, silencing potential competitors with sums that left the auctioneer momentarily speechless. And finally, "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, a gold locket containing a portrait of Mrs. Whitfield's late mother. A fine piece with genuine gemstones, starting bid at $20. "50, the stranger said without hesitation. The crowd gasped. Abigail's fingers curled into her palm. That locket was the last thing her mother had given her before succumbing to influenza 10 years prior. She'd hoped to keep it, had begged the bank for just that one exception, but Mr. Harris had been unmovable. "Sold," the gavel came down with finality. "That concludes today's auction. Buyers, please collect your items and settle accounts with my assistant." As the crowd dispersed, Abigail watched the mysterious stranger approach the collection table. He paid without counting his money, loading each item with surprising care into a large wooden crate he'd brought with him. When he lifted the crate, their eyes met across the yard. For a fleeting moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, though she was certain they'd never met. He tipped his hat slightly, then turned and loaded the crate onto a wagon parked at the edge of her property. "Mrs. Whitfield." Mr. Harris from the bank materialized at her elbow, holding an envelope. "The auction proceeds. After the bank's portion, this is what remains. It should be enough to secure modest lodgings in town until you determine your future arrangements." She accepted the envelope without a word, knowing the sum inside wouldn't last more than a month. As Mr. Harris walked away, she caught sight of the stranger again, mounting a handsome chestnut gelding beside his wagon. A ranch hand he'd hired was climbing onto the wagon's bench. "Who is that man?" she asked Mrs. Templeton, her nearest neighbor who had come to offer moral support. "That's Xavier Blackburn," Mrs. Templeton replied. "Bought the old Redfield place north of town about 2 months ago. Keeps to himself mostly. Some say he struck silver in Nevada before coming here." Abigail watched as Xavier Blackburn rode away, taking with him the physical remnants of her family's history. By sunset, she would need to be gone from this house as well, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known. The boarding house on Pine Street was clean but sparse, with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking Kennewick's Main Street. Abigail unpacked her meager belongings: clothing, a few books, and a small wooden box containing her wedding ring and the letters Thomas had written during their courtship. Everything else was gone. She'd secured a position at the town's general store starting tomorrow. Mr. Finch had offered her the job out of pity, she suspected, but she couldn't afford to let pride stand in her way. Not anymore. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind replaying the auction, focusing on the stranger Xavier Blackburn and his curious determination to acquire every piece of her family's history. What use would a wealthy rancher have for a woman's tea set or an old pocket watch? Perhaps he was a collector of sorts, or maybe he simply enjoyed the power that came with outbidding everyone else. Whatever his motivation, it left a bitter taste in her mouth. The following weeks established a routine that, while not satisfying, at least provided structure to Abigail's days. She rose early, took breakfast with the other boarders, worked at Finch's general store until dusk, then returned to her room to read or sew by lamplight until sleep claimed her. She was polite but reserved with the townspeople, accepting their sympathy with quiet dignity while inwardly counting the days until she could leave Kennewick and the memories it held. It was nearly a month after the auction when the bell above the shop door jingled, announcing a customer. Abigail looked up from the inventory ledger she was updating and froze. Xavier Blackburn filled the doorway, removing his hat as he stepped inside. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a striking shade of blue that contrasted with his sun-darkened skin and the dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield." His voice was deep, with a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Mr. Blackburn." She straightened, setting down her pencil. "How may I help you?" He approached the counter, seeming oddly hesitant for a man of his stature. "I was hoping to speak with you about a matter of some importance, perhaps when you're finished with work." "Whatever business you wish to discuss, we can address it now." She kept her tone professional despite the curiosity prickling at her skin. Xavier glanced toward the back of the store, where Mr. Finch was helping another customer. "This is somewhat private. Would you consider joining me for dinner at the hotel restaurant this evening?" 7 o'clock. Abigail hesitated. The proper response would be to decline. A widow dining alone with an unmarried man would certainly cause talk. Yet something in his expression, an earnestness that seemed at odds with his imposing presence, gave her pause. "I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Blackburn, but I don't think that would be appropriate." "Of course." He nodded, accepting her refusal without argument. "Perhaps I could call on you at the boarding house. Mrs. Sullivan is a suitable chaperone, I believe." His knowledge of her living situation and the boarding house proprietor startled her. "You seem well informed about my circumstances." A flush crept up his neck. "Kennewick is a small town, Mrs. Whitfield." "News travels." She studied him for a moment. "Very well, I finish here at 6. I'll be at the boarding house by 1:30. Thank you." He settled his hat back on his head. "Until this evening, then." Abigail watched him leave, wondering what possible business Xavier Blackburn could have with her. She'd seen him only from a distance since the auction, riding through town occasionally or stopping at the bank. According to town gossip, he employed several hands at his ranch and was investing in quality breeding stock. Some said he was bringing in water engineers from back east to implement new irrigation methods that could revolutionize ranching in the territory. Whatever his success, it had been built on the remnants of her failure, at least in part. The thought soured her anticipation of their meeting. At precisely 7 o'clock, Mrs. Sullivan showed Xavier into the boarding house parlor. He'd exchanged his working clothes for a well-tailored dark suit, though he'd kept his boots rather than city shoes. He looked both handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire. "Mrs. Whitfield," he bowed slightly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Please sit." She indicated the chair opposite hers, noting that Mrs. Sullivan had positioned herself at her desk across the room, close enough to observe but far enough to allow private conversation. Xavier sat, placing his hat on his knee. "I'll come straight to the point. The items I purchased at your auction, I'd like to return them to you." Of all the things she'd imagined he might say, this was not among them. "I beg your pardon, your family heirlooms. They belong with you." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "I have them safely stored at my ranch. You can collect them at your convenience, or I can have them delivered." Abigail's mind raced to make sense of his offer. "Mr. Blackburn, those items were sold fairly. You paid good money for them." "I bought them with the intention of returning them to you." He placed the envelope on the small table between them. "This contains the details of where everything is being kept. Nothing has been damaged or altered in any way." "Why would you do such a thing?" She made no move to take the envelope. Xavier looked down at his hat, turning the brim slightly in his hands. "I know what it's like to lose connection to your past. When I saw what was happening at the auction, I couldn't stand by and watch those pieces of your history be scattered to the winds." His words struck a chord deep within her. Since Thomas's death, she'd felt adrift, and the loss of her family treasures had severed one of the last anchors to who she had been. "That's uncommonly kind," she said carefully, "but I can't accept. The bank has been paid. The transaction is complete. I'm not asking for reimbursement, which makes it charity, Mr. Blackburn, not charity." His eyes met hers with surprising intensity. "Consider it a neighbor's courtesy." Abigail found herself momentarily unable to look away from those blue eyes. There was something familiar about them, though she was certain they'd never met before the auction. "Even so," she finally said, "I cannot accept such an extravagant courtesy from a man I barely know." Xavier nodded slowly, as though he'd anticipated her resistance. "Then perhaps we should remedy that. Allow me to properly introduce myself." He set his hat aside. "My name is Xavier Blackburn. I was born in Boston, raised in Philadelphia, and spent the last decade moving westward. I've worked as a cattle driver, a silver miner, and briefly as a deputy in a Colorado town too small to warrant a name on most maps." Despite herself, Abigail was intrigued. "What brings you to Kennewick, Mr. Blackburn?" A desire to put down roots. His expression softened. "I've spent too many years drifting. When I heard about the Redfield Ranch being available, it seemed like the right opportunity at the right time. And now you're in the business of rescuing family heirlooms from distressed widows." A slight smile touched his lips. "Only the ones who demonstrate remarkable courage in the face of adversity." She felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. "You know nothing about me, sir. I know you've faced terrible losses with dignity. I know you've taken honest work rather than seeking easier paths that might have been available to a woman of your qualities." His voice had dropped slightly, and Abigail was suddenly very aware of Mrs. Sullivan's presence across the room. "Mr. Blackburn, please call me Xavier." He leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm not attempting to embarrass you or place you in my debt. I simply want to return what rightfully belongs in your family. If you find that unacceptable now, perhaps in time, as we become better acquainted, you'll reconsider." The implication that they would continue to know each other hung in the air between them. Abigail found herself surprisingly unwilling to dismiss the possibility. "I appreciate your intentions," she said finally, "but I need time to consider your offer." "Of course." He rose, collecting his hat. "The envelope contains directions to my ranch, should you decide to visit. Your belongings will be waiting whenever you're ready." She stood as well. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Xavier." His name felt foreign on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her suddenly conscious of the simple gray dress she wore and the loose tendril of hair that had escaped her normally tidy bun. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Whitfield." "Abigail," she found herself saying, "if we are to be acquaintances." The smile that spread across his face transformed his features, softening the angles and bringing a light to his eyes that nearly took her breath away. "Abigail, then. Good evening." After he left, Abigail picked up the envelope he'd left behind, turning it over in her hands. Mrs. Sullivan approached with a knowing look that made Abigail straighten defensively. "He seems like a fine gentleman," the older woman remarked. "He's a stranger with unusual notions about property ownership," Abigail replied, tucking the envelope into her pocket. Mrs. Sullivan smiled. "Your husband has been gone nearly a year, my dear. It wouldn't be inappropriate to consider new acquaintances." "I wasn't," Abigail began, then stopped herself. "Good night, Mrs. Sullivan." In the privacy of her room, Abigail opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly drawn map showing the route to the Redfield, now Blackburn Ranch, along with a list of the items he'd purchased, categorized by type and apparent sentimental value. The detail and care evident in the document was touching. He'd even noted which items seemed to be wedding gifts, based on the inscriptions or styles. She sat on the edge of her bed, conflicted. Accepting his offer meant acknowledging she couldn't protect her family legacy on her own. Rejecting it meant permanently losing those connections to her past. Neither option sat comfortably. As she prepared for bed, Abigail found herself thinking of Xavier's eyes, not just their striking color, but the earnestness in them. She'd seen sincerity there, and perhaps something else she wasn't ready to name. It had been a long time since a man had looked at her that way. Since before Thomas had grown ill and their life together had become a series of desperate struggles against misfortune. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. The following Sunday after church services, Abigail was surprised when Pastor Miller approached her. "Mrs. Whitfield, I wanted to let you know that an anonymous donor has contributed to the church restoration fund in your late husband's name, a substantial amount." "Anonymous," she repeated, though she immediately suspected who might be responsible. "Yes, though they ask that you specifically be informed of the donation." The pastor smiled kindly. "Thomas was well loved in this community. It's good to see his memory honored." Abigail thanked him, then scanned the churchyard. Xavier stood near the gate, engaged in conversation with the blacksmith. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, meeting her eyes across the distance. He gave a small nod but made no move to approach her. That evening, Abigail wrote a brief note. "Mr. Blackburn, I would like to accept your invitation to visit your ranch this Saturday, if convenient. A. Whitfield." She delivered it to the general store the next morning, knowing it would be included in the regular delivery to outlying farms and ranches. By Wednesday, a reply had arrived. "Mrs. Whitfield, Saturday would be perfect. I'll send a carriage at 10 a.m. X Blackburn. The anticipation that built over the following days surprised Abigail. She found herself taking special care with her appearance on Saturday morning, selecting her best day dress, a deep blue cotton with minimal trim, and arranging her hair more carefully than usual. Mrs. Sullivan noticed and offered a knowing smile but mercifully said nothing. True to his word, a well-maintained carriage arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. The driver, a weathered man who introduced himself as Caleb, helped her into the seat with a respectful tip of his hat. "Mr. Blackburn sends his apologies for not collecting you himself, madam," Caleb explained as they set off. "Had some urgent business with the new cattle that arrived yesterday." The journey to the Blackburn Ranch took them north of town, following the river before turning onto a well-maintained road that wound through rolling grasslands punctuated by stands of pine. Abigail remembered the Redfield place as a modest operation with good water access but challenging terrain. As they crested a hill, she was astonished by the transformation. Where once stood a simple cabin and barn, a proper ranch house now commanded the property. Built of local timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, it sat comfortably against the backdrop of distant mountains. New fencing enclosed expanded pastures, and several outbuildings clustered nearby. Men on horseback moved cattle in the distance, while others worked on what appeared to be an irrigation channel. Caleb guided the horses to the front of the house, where Xavier was waiting on the porch. He wore simpler clothes today, a clean shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a vest that had seen honest work. He approached the carriage with that same smile that had lingered in Abigail's memory. "Welcome to Riverside Ranch," he said, offering his hand to help her down. "I hope the journey wasn't too tiring." "Not at all," she replied, acutely aware of the warmth of his hand as it briefly held hers. "You've made impressive improvements to the property." Pride flashed in his eyes. "Thank you. We've been working hard these past months." "Would you like a tour before we address the matter that brought you here?" Abigail nodded, curious to see more of what he'd built. Xavier guided her through the main house first, a surprisingly comfortable space with solid furniture and large windows that captured the mountain views. Though unmistakably a bachelor's home, it showed signs of careful planning, with bookshelves filled with volumes on agriculture, literature, and history, and simple but quality furnishings. "The kitchen needs a woman's touch," he admitted as they passed through the spacious but sparsely equipped room where a middle-aged woman was preparing what smelled like fresh bread. "Mrs. Hanson comes in 3 times a week to cook and keep things in order, but I'm afraid my culinary requirements are rather basic." "Mrs. Hanson," Abigail greeted the cook with a smile. The woman returned it with a knowing glance between her and Xavier that made Abigail flush slightly. Outside, Xavier showed her the stables, the new barn, and the innovative irrigation system he was implementing. "The land here is good, but water management is everything," he explained as they walked along a partially completed channel. "With proper irrigation, we can double the grazing capacity and introduce more drought-resistant forage." His knowledge and enthusiasm were impressive. This was clearly no hobby ranch bought with silver money. Xavier Blackburn understood the business of cattle and land management. As they walked, he introduced her to several of his ranch hands, all of whom showed him clear respect without the fear or resentment she'd sometimes observed between workers and their employers. "You've built something remarkable here in a short time," she said as they made their way back toward the house. "The Redfields would hardly recognize their old place." "I hope they'd approve of the changes," Xavier replied. "Mrs. Redfield wrote me a kind letter after the sale, saying she was pleased the land would continue as a working ranch rather than being divided up. At the house, Xavier led her to his study, a warm room with a large desk and walls lined with more books and maps. A large wooden crate sat in the corner, covered with a clean cloth. "Your family treasures," he said, removing the cloth to reveal the familiar items from the auction. As promised, all accounted for and undamaged. Abigail approached the crate slowly, emotion tightening her throat as she saw her mother's tea set, her father's pocket watch, and all the other pieces that represented generations of her family's history. She lifted the gold locket, opening it to see her mother's delicate portrait inside. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "Your being here is thanks enough." Xavier stood nearby, watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. "I had them cleaned and polished where appropriate, but otherwise left everything as it was." She turned to face him, the locket still in her hand. "Why did you really do this, Xavier? The truth." He hesitated, then gestured to one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace. When they were both seated, he leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees. "When I was 10 years old, my family lost everything in a banking collapse," he began. "My father had been a successful merchant in Boston, and overnight we went from comfort to destitution. The creditors took everything, not just our home and business, but every personal item of value. My mother's jewelry, family portraits, even books that had been passed down for generations." Abigail's heart ached for the child he'd been. "That must have been devastating. It destroyed my father. He never recovered, died within 2 years." Xavier's voice remained steady, but Abigail could sense the old pain beneath his words. "My mother and I moved to Philadelphia to live with her brother. I promised myself that when I could, I would find our family possessions and bring them home. But by the time I had the means, it was too late. They were scattered beyond recovery, and my mother had passed as well. Understanding dawned. So when you saw my situation, I saw a chance to prevent someone else from losing those connections to their past." His eyes met hers. "I know it seemed presumptuous, but I couldn't stand by and do nothing." The pure sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. "It wasn't presumptuous. It was one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for me." The tension in his shoulders eased visibly. "Then you'll accept them back?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "But I insist on some form of repayment when I'm able." Xavier shook his head. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Abigail said firmly. "My pride has taken enough blows this past year. Please allow me this dignity." He studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Very well. We'll discuss terms whenever you're ready, but there's no hurry." Their conversation over lunch on the veranda flowed more easily after that. Xavier told her of his travels across the West, his brief stint as a deputy, and his decision to settle in Montana Territory. Abigail found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Kennewick, her courtship with Thomas, and their dreams for the small ranch that had ultimately slipped through their fingers after his death. "Thomas was a good man," she said, watching a hawk circling in the distance. "But he wasn't a born rancher. His father had been a banker, and Thomas grew up in St. Louis. He loved the idea of the West more than the reality of it." "And you?" Xavier asked. "Do you love the reality of it?" She considered the question seriously. "I love the honesty of it. The land doesn't pretend to be gentle or forgiving, but it rewards those who understand and respect it." She smiled ruefully. "Unfortunately, understanding wasn't enough when the cattle sickness came through." "Would you try again? If you could," the question startled her. "You mean ranching?" "Or anything, if circumstances allowed." Abigail hadn't permitted herself such thoughts since Thomas's death. Survival had consumed her energy and attention. "I suppose I would," she said slowly. "Not cattle, perhaps, but I've always thought a small orchard might thrive on the north section of the old property. Thomas's father had apple orchards in Missouri that did well. Xavier nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Before he could respond, Caleb approached with an apologetic interruption. "Sorry, boss, but that new bull is causing trouble again. Broke through the north fence." "Excuse me," Xavier said, rising quickly. "I need to handle this. Please make yourself comfortable. I shouldn't be long." Abigail watched him stride away with Caleb, his easy authority evident in the way he immediately began issuing calm, clear instructions to the men who joined them. Left alone, she explored the veranda and gardens, admiring the careful planning evident in the layout. Someone, Xavier himself, perhaps had planted native wildflowers along the pathways, their colors bright against the backdrop of prairie grasses. Nearly an hour passed before Xavier returned, looking slightly disheveled but satisfied. "Crisis averted," he said with a smile that didn't quite hide his fatigue. "I apologize for abandoning you. No apology needed. It's clear you have a well-run operation here." She hesitated, then added, "I should probably be getting back to town soon." Disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded. "Of course, I'll have Caleb bring the carriage around." He gestured toward the crate in his study. "And I'll have that delivered to your boarding house tomorrow, if that's acceptable." "Yes, thank you." Abigail felt suddenly reluctant to leave, though she had no reason to stay longer. "I've enjoyed seeing your ranch. Perhaps you might visit again." The question held a careful casualness that didn't quite mask his interest. "When you're not busy at the store. I could show you the western pastures where we're experimenting with those new irrigation techniques." The invitation warmed her. "I would like that." As they waited for the carriage, an awkward silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Abigail found herself studying Xavier's profile against the afternoon light, noting the strength in his jaw, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of smiles and squinting into western suns. "Abigail," he said suddenly, turning to face her. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I want you to know that my interest in your welfare extends beyond returning your family heirlooms." Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've admired you from the moment I saw you standing with such dignity at that auction. Your resilience, your grace under pressure," he broke off, seeming to search for words. "Forgive me, I'm not expressing myself well." "You're expressing yourself perfectly clearly," she said softly. Something shifted in his eyes, hope, perhaps. "Then may I call on you properly? In town, I mean." Without the pretext of business. The carriage appeared around the corner of the house before she could answer. Xavier's expression remained carefully neutral, awaiting her response. "Yes," Abigail said, surprising herself with the lack of hesitation in her voice. "I would welcome your call, Xavier." The smile that spread across his face was worth any risk of town gossip. He helped her into the carriage with gentle hands, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Until then," he said, stepping back as Caleb took up the reins. As the carriage carried her back toward Kennewick, Abigail found herself smiling despite the dust of the road and the afternoon heat. The landscape seemed brighter somehow, more vibrant than it had appeared on the journey out. She touched the pocket where she'd placed her mother's locket, the metal warm against her fingers. For the first time since Thomas's death, the future held something more than mere survival. It held possibility. True to his word, Xavier had the crate of family heirlooms delivered to the boarding house the following day. Mrs. Sullivan helped her arrange the items in her small room, exclaiming over the quality of the silver tea service and the craftsmanship of the chess set. "That Mr. Blackburn is quite the gentleman," Mrs. Sullivan remarked, carefully placing the pocket watch on Abigail's modest dresser. To purchase these things only to return them to you. He is unusually thoughtful, Abigail agreed, unwilling to discuss the feelings stirring within her. And handsome, the older woman added with a twinkle in her eye. The eligible ladies of Kennewick have certainly taken notice of him, though he seems to have eyes only for Mrs. Sullivan, Abigail interrupted gently. I believe you mentioned needing help with the curtains in the parlor. The landlady chuckled, but allowed the subject to drop. Later that evening, as Abigail prepared for bed, she found herself wondering which of Kennewick's unmarried women might have set their caps for Xavier. The thought brought an unexpected pang of jealousy that she quickly tried to dismiss. She had no claim on him, after all, despite his request to call on her. The following Wednesday, Xavier appeared at the general store shortly before closing time. He was dressed in a clean shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed, though a faint smudge of dust on his boots suggested he'd come directly from the ranch. Mrs. Whitfield, he greeted her with a tip of his hat. I was hoping you might join me for dinner at the hotel this evening. Mr. Finch, who had been pretending to organize a shelf nearby, suddenly developed an intense interest in a can of peaches. Abigail felt her cheeks warm. I would be delighted, she replied, aware that by tomorrow the entire town would be discussing this development. The hotel restaurant was Kennewick's finest dining establishment, which wasn't saying much compared to larger towns, but the food was good and the atmosphere pleasant. Heads turned as Xavier escorted Abigail to a table by the window, his hand lightly touching her elbow in a gesture that was both protective and proud. Conversation flowed easily between them, touching on books they'd both enjoyed, places they'd visited, and their shared love of the Montana landscape. Xavier told her more about his plans for the ranch, including his hope to eventually breed horses as well as cattle. I've always had a way with horses, he explained. My uncle in Philadelphia raised carriage horses, and I spent most of my youth in his stables rather than in school. Yet you're clearly well educated, Abigail observed. He smiled. My mother insisted on books and tutors, even when we had little else. She believed education was the one thing that couldn't be taken away. As they shared dessert, a surprisingly good apple pie, Xavier grew more serious. Abigail, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. A business proposition of sorts. She set down her fork, curious. What kind of proposition? I mentioned that I'm expanding the ranch operations. One area I'm interested in exploring is exactly what you mentioned during your visit orchards. His eyes held hers intently. Your knowledge could be valuable, and I thought perhaps we might form a partnership. A partnership, she repeated, unsure of his meaning. Yes, I have the land and resources. You have the experience and understanding of what varieties might thrive here. He leaned forward slightly. You mentioned wanting to repay me for the heirlooms. This could be your contribution helping establish a successful orchard operation. Abigail considered the offer carefully. It was generous yet respected her wish to maintain her independence. What exactly would this partnership entail? Initially, consultation on planning and setup. Later, perhaps more direct management if you were interested. Xavier hesitated, then added, the arrangement would include fair compensation, of course. You're offering me employment. I'm offering you a share in a venture that I believe could be profitable for both of us. His voice lowered slightly. And an opportunity to pursue something you expressed interest in. The thoughtfulness behind his proposal touched her deeply. He wasn't simply offering charity or even conventional employment, he was offering her a chance to create something of her own again. I would need to maintain my position at the general store, at least initially, she said, thinking practically. Mr. Finch has been very good to me. Of course. We could arrange for you to visit the ranch on your days off. Once the trees are planted, they'll need regular but not constant attention." His expression brightened at her implicit acceptance. "Does this mean you're considering the offer?" "I'm more than considering it," Abigail said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I accept." The weeks that followed established a new pattern in Abigail's life. Saturdays became her days at Riverside Ranch, where she and Xavier walked the land, discussing soil conditions, water access, and which apple varieties might best withstand Montana's harsh winters and hot summers. They pored over agricultural journals together, wrote letters to orchardists in similar climates, and gradually developed a plan for a 5-acre orchard to start, with room for expansion if successful. These shared projects brought them naturally closer. Xavier's respect for her knowledge and opinions was evident in the way he listened intently to her suggestions, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. For her part, Abigail found herself increasingly drawn to his combination of ambition and practicality, his genuine kindness toward his workers, and the quiet moments when he would sometimes pause their work to simply appreciate the beauty of the land around them. By midsummer, the foundation for their partnership had been laid. Xavier had ordered 200 saplings to be delivered in early spring, secured the necessary equipment, and begun preparing the land under Abigail's guidance. Their business relationship had flourished, built on mutual respect and shared goals. Their personal relationship, however, remained in a cautious state of unspoken potential. Xavier called on her regularly in town, taking her to dinner or accompanying her to church socials. They were seen together often enough that Kennewick had begun to accept them as a pair of sorts, though neither had formally declared any intentions beyond friendship and business. It was during the town's Independence Day celebration that something shifted between them. The entire community had gathered for a picnic by the river, with games for the children, dancing, and enough food to feed 3 counties. As twilight approached, Xavier led Abigail away from the crowds to a quiet spot beneath a large cottonwood tree where they could watch the promised fireworks display. "I've been meaning to show you something," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden box, smoothed by years of handling. "This is the only family heirloom I managed to keep." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small, perfectly clear diamond. "It was my grandmother's, then my mother's. When everything else was taken, my mother hid this in her sewing basket. The creditors overlooked it." "It's beautiful," Abigail said, touched that he would share this precious connection to his past with her. "I've been carrying it with me since I was 16. His voice had grown softer, more intimate in the gathering dusk. "My mother gave it to me before she died, saying I should one day give it to a woman who embodied the strength and grace that had carried our family through difficult times." The implication of his words hung in the warm summer air between them. Abigail's heart began to race. "Xavier," she began, unsure what she wanted to say, "I'm not proposing. Not yet." He closed the box carefully, returning it to his pocket. "I know it's too soon and you may not feel as I do. But I wanted you to know that my intentions toward you are serious and honorable." In the distance, the first of the fireworks exploded against the darkening sky, casting Xavier's face in momentary red light. Abigail found herself studying the strong lines of his profile, the gentle curve of his mouth, the hope and vulnerability in his expression. "And how do you feel?" she asked softly. He turned to face her fully, the next burst of fireworks reflecting in his eyes. "I believe I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Whitfield, more with each passing day." The simple honesty of his declaration took her breath away. Since Thomas's death, She'd locked away any expectation of romantic love, focusing instead on mere survival. Xavier's words unlocked something within her, a capacity for joy and hope she'd thought permanently diminished. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't need to say anything now." He reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "I just wanted you to know where I stand. The rest can unfold as it will." They watched the remainder of the fireworks display hand in hand, each lost in thought yet profoundly aware of the other's presence. When Xavier escorted her back to the boarding house that night, his goodbye was the same as always, a tip of his hat and a warm smile, but something fundamental had changed between them. That night, lying in bed surrounded by the family treasures Xavier had returned to her, Abigail finally acknowledged the truth to herself. She was falling in love with him too. August brought scorching heat to the Montana territory, drying creeks and testing the new irrigation systems at Riverside Ranch. Abigail continued her Saturday visits, now as much to see Xavier as to work on their orchard project. They developed a comfortable routine, spending mornings reviewing plans or inspecting the land, sharing lunch on the veranda, then often riding out to see other parts of the property in the cooler evening hours. It was during one such evening ride, as they paused to let their horses drink from a spring-fed pool, that Xavier broached the subject that had been increasingly on his mind. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, dismounting to stretch his legs. "About the orchard, the ranch, and us." Abigail remained on her mare, suddenly needing the slight distance. "What about us? I've made no secret of my feelings." He approached, looking up at her with those earnest blue eyes. "But I've been patient, not wanting to rush you." "I appreciate that," she said softly. "The thing is, Abigail." He reached up to help her down from the saddle. As her feet touched the ground, his hands lingered at her waist. "I don't want to just be patient anymore. I want to court you properly, with the intention of marriage if you'll have me." The directness of his declaration sent a warmth flooding through her that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "Xavier, before you answer," he continued, "I want you to know that accepting me wouldn't mean giving up your independence or your dreams for the orchard. That would still be yours to manage as you see fit. I'm asking you to be my partner in every sense: life, business, family." The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. This was no conventional proposal based on convenience or social expectation. Xavier was offering her something she'd never quite had with Thomas, for all that they'd loved each other: true equality in their shared life. "I would be honored to court you with that intention," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "But I want to be certain, for both our sakes." Relief and joy transformed his face. "That's all I ask, to have the chance to show you what we could be together." The moment hung suspended between them, filled with possibility. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, Xavier drew her closer. "May I kiss you, Abigail?" Her answer was to rise on her toes, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers with tender restraint at first, then with growing passion as she responded. His arms encircled her completely, strong and secure, while her hands found their way to his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath his shirt. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the first time I saw you. At the auction," she asked, surprised. "Even then, you stood so proud despite everything." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I knew then that you were extraordinary." The ride back to the ranch was filled with a new awareness between them, stolen glances and shared smiles that spoke volumes. By the time Xavier helped her into the carriage that would return her to town, they had established the parameters of their courtship. He would call on her more frequently in town. They would continue their work on the orchard, and they would allow themselves the time to be certain before making any formal announcements. News of their courtship spread quickly through Kennewick, generating the expected mixture of approval, envy, and speculation. Most were supportive. Xavier had proven himself a valuable addition to the community, investing in local businesses and providing steady employment. A few, particularly mothers of unmarried daughters, sniffed that it was all very convenient for the widow Whitfield to secure such a prosperous match. Abigail paid little attention to the gossip. For the first time in years, she found herself genuinely happy, looking forward to each day rather than merely enduring it. Her work at the general store remained steady, but Mr. Finch had begun training a young man to take over some of her duties, understanding that her future might soon lead her elsewhere. September brought the first hint of autumn, with cooler nights and the occasional golden leaf drifting down from the cottonwoods along the river. Xavier and Abigail's courtship deepened, their conversations moving beyond ranch business and town gossip to more personal matters: hopes for family, views on child rearing, dreams for the future. On a particularly beautiful Sunday afternoon, Xavier surprised Abigail with a picnic basket and an invitation to ride to a special spot on his property. They traveled on horseback, Abigail now comfortable enough with riding to keep pace with him along the well-maintained trails. He led her to a high meadow overlooking the valley, where the mountains rose purple and majestic in the distance, and the river wound like a silver ribbon through the landscape below. A single large pine tree provided shade, and Xavier spread a blanket beneath its branches. "This is breathtaking," Abigail said, turning slowly to take in the panoramic view. "I can see why you chose this spot." "I come here to think sometimes," Xavier admitted, unpacking bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine from the basket. "It helps me keep perspective." They ate leisurely, enjoying the simple fare and each other's company. As they finished the last of the wine, Xavier grew uncharacteristically quiet, his expression thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" Abigail asked, reaching to touch his hand. He smiled, turning his palm up to interlace their fingers. "Actually, yes, I've been thinking about timing." "Timing?" "Yes." He shifted to face her more directly. "The orchard saplings will arrive in April. The south pasture expansion will be complete by November. The new well should be finished next month." Abigail raised an eyebrow, amused by his catalog of ranch improvements. "All excellent progress. The point is," he continued, "everything is falling into place. The ranch is becoming what I envisioned, the only thing missing." He paused, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw the familiar wooden box. "The only thing missing is you by my side, not just as a visitor but as my wife." Abigail's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing his grandmother's ring. The diamond caught the afternoon sunlight, scattering tiny rainbows across the blanket. "I love you, Abigail Whitfield," Xavier said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you study agricultural journals with the same intensity some women give to fashion plates. I love how you never gave up, even when everything was taken from you." He took the ring from its box, holding it between them. "Will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children. Share this land and this life with me." Tears blurred Abigail's vision as the full weight of the moment settled upon her. This wasn't just about love or convenience, it was about building something lasting together, about creating a future neither of them could achieve alone. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as though it had been made for her. When he kissed her, It was with a depth of feeling that left her breathless and certain. They were married on the first Saturday of October in Kennewick's small church. The building overflowed with townsfolk and ranch hands alike, all eager to witness the union of the widow Whitfield and the rancher Blackburn. Abigail wore a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered from Helena, with her mother's locket around her neck and small white flowers in her hair. Xavier waited at the altar, more handsome than she'd ever seen him in a black suit with a silver brocade vest, his usually wind-swept hair tamed for the occasion. The look of pure adoration on his face as she walked down the aisle would remain etched in her memory forever. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with traditional vows spoken in voices that carried clearly through the hushed church. When Pastor Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier's kiss was restrained but full of promise, drawing good-natured cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward, held on the grounds of Riverside Ranch, continued well into the evening. Lanterns illuminated the yard, a local band played lively tunes for dancing, and tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by nearly every household in Kennewick. Abigail danced with her new husband beneath the stars, feeling a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. "Happy, Mrs. Blackburn," Xavier murmured against her ear as they swayed to a slower melody. "Impossibly so," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "Though I still can't quite believe we're here like this. Believe it." His arms tightened around her. "This is just the beginning." Later, when the last guests had departed and the ranch hands had discreetly made themselves scarce, Xavier carried Abigail across the threshold of what was now their home. They moved through the house, now transformed by Abigail's touch over the preceding week's curtains at the windows, family pictures on the walls, her mother's tea set displayed proudly in the dining room. In the master bedroom, nervousness briefly overtook her. Despite having been married before, this felt new and significant in a way she couldn't articulate. Xavier sensed her hesitation and approached slowly, taking her hands in his. "We have all the time in the world," he said softly. "Nothing needs to happen that you're not ready for." His consideration nearly undid her. "It's not that," she explained, squeezing his hands. "I want you, it's just different this time, more." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Because it's a choice freely made without necessity or convenience." "Yes." She stepped closer, resting her palms against his chest. "Because it's love, pure and simple." His kiss was gentle at first, then increasingly urgent as she responded with equal fervor. They undressed each other slowly, learning curves and planes with reverent hands. When they finally came together, it was with a passion that transcended physical desire, a joining of souls as much as bodies. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight spilled through the curtains, Abigail felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged, with this man who had returned her past to her and now offered a future beyond anything she could have imagined. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I'm thinking about family heirlooms," she replied truthfully. "About how sometimes the most valuable things find their way back to us when we least expect it." He smiled, understanding her meaning. "And sometimes what seems like an ending is actually a beginning." "Exactly." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him properly. "Thank you for buying my family's treasures that day." "Thank you for eventually accepting them back," he countered, "and for accepting me." They fell asleep in each other's arms, the first night of many in a marriage that would weather its share of challenges but remain strong through the decades to come. Spring arrived the following year, bringing with it the promised apple saplings, and another, more precious new beginning, the news that Abigail was expecting their first child. As they planted the tiny trees that would one day become a productive orchard, Xavier couldn't help seeing parallels to their growing family. "This one's for the baby," he said, carefully positioning a sapling in the prepared soil. "It'll bear fruit around the time he or she is old enough to climb it." Abigail, her condition not yet visible beneath her practical work dress, smiled at the thought. "Our child will grow up surrounded by beautiful things: trees, mountains, open skies." "And family heirlooms," Xavier added, tamping the soil around the sapling's roots. "Stories and traditions to pass on." Speaking of which, Abigail reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. "I have something for you." Xavier straightened, brushing dirt from his hands before accepting the bundle. Unwrapping it, he found a silver pocket watch, not her father's, but one he recognized from a jeweler's shop in Helena. "I had it engraved," she said, watching his face carefully. He opened the case to read the inscription inside. "To Xavier, who returned my past and gave me a future. With all my love, Abigail." Emotion tightened his throat as he ran his thumb over the delicate engraving. "This is perfect. I thought perhaps it could become a new family heirloom," she explained. "Something to pass down to our children someday, along with the story of how their father once bought and returned a family's treasures, and in doing so, found his greatest treasure of all." Xavier slipped the watch into his vest pocket, then drew Abigail into his arms, mindful of her condition. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of all they'd built together. "And I love you," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him amidst the newly planted saplings of their orchard, symbols of roots taking hold and branches reaching toward the future. That autumn, Abigail gave birth to a son they named James Thomas Blackburn, a strong boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined chin. He was the first of 3 children who would grow up running through the orchard, riding horses across the expanding ranch lands, and learning the value of both preserving the past and building for the future. The Riverside Ranch prospered under the Blackburn stewardship, becoming one of the largest and most innovative operations in the territory. The apple orchard, Abigail's particular domain, developed a reputation for producing exceptional fruit, eventually expanding to 20 acres and multiple varieties. The silver pocket watch Xavier carried became just the first of many new family treasures, joining the older heirlooms in a legacy that would continue for generations. On their 25th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the veranda watching their grandchildren play beneath apple trees now tall and laden with fruit, Xavier took Abigail's hand, the same one that still wore his grandmother's ring. "Was it worth it?" he asked, the question encompassing all they'd built together. Abigail looked out over their land, the prosperous ranch, the thriving orchard, the family gathered around them, and thought of the day long ago when she'd stood watching her family's treasures being auctioned away, never imagining that loss would lead her here. "Beyond measure," she replied, leaning against the shoulder of the man who had returned her past and, in doing so, given her a future more precious than any heirloom could ever be.